Okay. Welcome, everyone. I wanted to make sure I was recording. This is Jane Bemis, and welcome to our League of Women Voters Long Beach area October event. We have a panel who have been working on this presentation with regard to policing reform. And I am going to turn it over to Carolyn Eggleston, who has taken the lead on pulling this panel of women together. Carolyn?
Good morning. Can you flip the slide? Welcome. We're so glad you're here. We want to spend some time today talking about policing reform and correctional reform. And I'd like to introduce our panelists because I think you'll enjoy what they have to say. Kim Ritter-Martinez is going to be talking about the LBPD budget and the union contract. Jane Adair will be talking about the defund the police efforts. Alice Pitts is going to discuss prison alternatives for juvenile offenders. Sheila LaFridge will be talking about policing and mental health emergencies. And then I'll come back and talk about some of the criminal justice bills and measures that are coming along. We did want to ask you to be a little bit careful with your question and answers. If you would make sure to put to whom you are addressing this, if you can, and we'll have most of the questions at the end. We'll have Alice Pitts answering questions at the time. So please do put in the questions that you want to have answered. I'd like to discuss just briefly the League of Women Voters state position on criminal justice. The League of Women Voters, California, supports a criminal justice system that is just, effective, equitable, transparent, and that fosters public trust at all stages, including policing practices, pretrial procedures, sentencing, incarceration, and reentry. The League also believes in the elimination of the systemic bias, including the disproportionate policing and incarceration of marginalized communities and policing practices that promote safety for both law enforcement officers and the communities they serve. Next slide. In addition, the League of Women Voters California believes in collaboration between government and community throughout every stage of the criminal justice system. A focus on humane treatment and rehabilitation with the goal of promoting the successful reentry into communities of those who have been incarcerated, and reliance on evidence-based research in decision-making about law enforcement programs and policies, which include scheduled periodic audits of program and policy effectiveness. So that's where we stand about our position on criminal justice. I'd like to turn it now over to Kim Ritter-Martinez to talk a little bit more about the unions. Thank you. Kim, you have to unmute.
Sorry about that. You'd think by now we'd all get the unmute thing, have it down. So good morning. I'm going to start our discussion with a quick overview of the Long Beach Police Department budget, and then we're going to do an introduction to police unions and the role that they play in our city government. So what we have here is a slide, and it's a breakdown of the Long Beach Police Department personnel by race and ethnicity compared with the makeup of the city as a whole. Now, reading from left to right, the pie charts show first managerial positions. The middle one is non-managerial positions within the police department. And then we see the demographic profile for the city as a whole. Now, the main takeaway here is that with the exception of our Asian population, the police department does not represent the racial diversity of the city. And as you can see from the charts, whites are overrepresented to Blacks and Hispanics in both management and non-management positions, although it's much more starkly represented in the management positions. And my screen just suddenly decided to stop. Slide stop advancing. Hold on one moment. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's talk about the city budget. The information contained in the next several slides can be found in the City of Long Beach FY21 budget document, which is online at the city's website. Now, this table shows portions of department budgets that are part of the general fund group. And I consolidated several line items to make the table easier to read. So in FY20, the police department budget was about $244 million and represented 44% of the city's general fund. At $240 million in FY21, the police department budget is slightly smaller, but the share remains roughly the same. Now, the total police department budget for the coming year is actually $264 million, and the difference being funds received from the Police and Fire Public Safety Oil Production Act, which was passed by voters in 2007. Now, this is a special tax on every barrel of oil produced in the city and is limited to funding police and fire services. Now, effective June this year, the tax was 33 cents a barrel, and projected revenues for this year is $3.3 million, and an increase of $164,000 over the FY20 budget. Now, in response to the revenue shortfall caused by the COVID-19 crisis, this year's budget reflects significant cuts to city services and personnel. The police department was not exempt from budget cuts, and a number of public safety reductions were adopted. Now, to cite just a few examples, there were cuts to the vice detail, the narcotics field team, there were cuts to the canine team, and additionally, 16 police officer positions are now being converted to community service assistants to respond to priority 3 calls. Now, priority 3 calls, those are non-violent 9/11 calls that are primarily requests for a report to be filled out after a property crime has been committed. Now, in total, 54 sworn police department positions were eliminated. Through the budgeting process, the city departments generated a net $16.3 million in savings through a combination of reductions in revenues and reallocations. Now, changes to the police budget represented 63% of the savings, or about $10 million. When potential furloughs are included, the FY21 reduction of the department is approximately $12.9 million, or 5.2% of their budgets. Now, in spite of the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the city remains committed to its racial equity and reconciliation initiatives, including enhancements to the police department. Now, to support that work, the city is creating an Office of Constitutional Policing that will reside within the police department. This new office will be dedicated to creating forward-looking changes in management practices, policies, training, recruitment, accountability, and constitutional policing. Now, the goal of this initiative is to build greater trust through increased responsiveness, transparency, and accountability. This office will also be responsible for ensuring that the department is in step with best practices in policy, legal mandates, and community expectations. It will be guided by data analytics for accountability and transparency, engagement with external groups and other city agencies for inclusivity and equity, and it will liaise with the city's Office of Equity. And this office will be staffed by reallocating a special projects officer and a lieutenant, as well as a business services specialist to perform the data analytics. And the expense will be offset by a reduction in budgeted overtime. All right, so that's the city budget as it pertains to the police department. And now we're going to have a brief discussion about police unions. Now, police unions have been around for about 100 years. New York started organizing in the 1890s. These associations were formed to lobby for better pay and hours and improvements to police houses. Early on, these organizations were referred to as Officers Association. This was because police unions were actually illegal in much of the United States, especially after a Boston police strike in 1919 that was suppressed. Cities understandably feared the negative political repercussions of permitting the independent organization of what were essentially agents of state violence. Likewise, the police also wanted to distance themselves from the labor movement because they were the ones out there breaking up the strikes at the time. To this day, the LA County Sheriffs refer to their union as the Association of LA County Deputy Sheriffs. So during those days, the police were also widely viewed as a cog in the wheel of corrupt city governments. But after World War II, pressure for reform started, especially to root out corruption. But also because the civil rights movement was starting to gain traction. The 50s and 60s were an era of professionalizing police departments. They were doing additional training and increased transparency through public oversight, and civilian review boards were instituted. Now, as you might imagine, police departments resisted reforms as antithetical to their work. They were invested in preserving a particular version of society and looked upon the civil rights protest and the anti-war protests of that era as subverting the order of things. So police unions really won widespread recognition and collective bargaining rights also during that time. And that's when they organized in response to reformers who were looking to rein in police corruption and police abuse that was falling heaviest on blacks and black communities. So what do police unions do? Well, collective bargaining agreements are the main thing. And what collective bargaining agreements are, they're legal constructs that give unions authority to bargain on behalf of their members. State law sets the terms unions can bargain for, and these things include pay, benefit, disciplinary procedures. And these agreements play a big role in police department culture. Now, social scientists who study these things have found that the introduction of collective bargaining is correlated with higher incidences of bad behavior. But as social scientists always like to point out, that correlation isn't necessary causation, and there's been a lot of academic work going on in this area. And remember also that bargaining also involves the city government with which the police department is, in fact, bargaining. So these city governments that are bargaining with the police, they also have to agree to these terms. And we found that reforms are also often accompanied by increased funding. So there's an exchange there. So activists in the growing movement for police reform in the US have targeted large police budgets as a central impediment to change. And this is the origin of calls to defund the police. However, if you look back even further into the police reform movement, other advocates have pinpointed another roadblock to progress, and that's police unions and the influences that they yield. So that concludes my remarks, and I'm now going to hand the presentation over to Jane Adair, who will talk to us about defunding the police.
Hi. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the defunding of the police. I put up a definition that you can see, two possibilities, and there are several possibilities the way you would define some of these terms. So one is reallocating funding away from the police department to other agencies, or doing away with or disbanding policing as it's done now. The way I've approached this is I would like, as you listen to this, to think about what points I'm making, but also when you listen to the other speakers, you'll see that they have a lot of detail about the police department and also other possible agencies. And so take that into account. I know number 7 says imagining what it could be, but as I go through this, you might think about that. I think I start with the purpose of policing, and I have just 3 purposes that I've come up with for this purposes of this presentation. One is to ensure public safety. Another is to prevent crime. And another would be to enforce laws. And of course they would overlap. And that's what, being overlapping is one of the reasons why this gets to be so, so intricate. And if you think about what that means, you know, what is the public safety? How do you prevent crime, and how do you enforce the laws? And I'm gonna leave that for a second and go on to what's driving this movement, I think. We have, of course, incidences like George Floyd. There were some incidences in the public school system, one being where a child was arrested for not doing their homework. Now that was a court-ordered thing, but still, that kind of behavior, perhaps over-criminalizing some minor crimes. That's part of what's driving this movement. Uneven policing, different areas of cities, and maybe use of inappropriate force. What you see often is there'll be an incident and there'll be some unrest or some marching, some protest. Then the people in charge, whoever they might be at the time, in whatever department or government or whatever they're in, will say something like, "We will do better." And then they will make some plans. They'll think about what to do better. And then I'm moving my head because for me, it's like a circle. And then they don't do better. And so then another incident happens. And you can see it as a cycle. Then I was thinking about the possible areas of change. And I was, for example, there's things you can take away, there are things you can place money in different areas, but like one of them, perhaps this going and taking, as Long Beach seems to be doing, going and taking reports on thefts, but maybe responding to barking dogs or loud parties, or even traffic. There's a lot involved in traffic. So those are things that are duties that the police do. Then there may be some that aren't quite as clear as to who might take them over, things like drug abuse, homelessness, and mental health. And perhaps something where there be cooperation between several departments or agencies might work with that. And then there's equipment. The biggest thing I've read about is the militarization equipment. I know that when I lived in Philadelphia, the head of police there wanted to buy a tank. And that's what I'm talking about, the kind of militarized equipment. It turned out he didn't do that, but that was something he wanted to do. So I was also, thinking about in schools, there's a possibility of maybe perhaps more counselors could take over from the police. And the schools have gotten rid of many counselors with their budget problems. I had recently read in the Press Telegram about the county and also parks, so public parks, who is going to be the people that monitor public parks. Is it going to be park people? Will it be police people? So then I was thinking also, I was looking into changes in hiring and changes in training. And so in that regard, I think that especially in training, the areas that might be improved are things like teaching communication skills, teaching trust, how to do that, how people can do that. De-escalation. And I think that de-escalation is not saying, okay, drop your gun or your whatever people think you have. That's not really a de-escalation technique. So there would have to be more of that. Also, I think areas that could be changed would be adding restorative justice, more of that. Changing how you try to bring down somebody and keep them under control. And that would be like the chokehold parts. And then going on to some more awareness of the community that you live in and what people want. Some possible other places that other alternatives services could be more youth services, more rec centers, trauma centers, more public health, more things that would involve youth as well as adults. And with that, I would like you to continue listening to what the other panelists have to say and imagine when they talk about what it could be. And I'm going to pass this off to Alice Pitts, and she'll be talking about eliminating prisons for juveniles. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to speak on the Department of Juvenile Justice Reform, Senate Bill 203, and a little bit about the court school education system. Senate Bill number 203 is an act to amend section 625.6 of the Welfare and Institution Code relating to juveniles and was approved by the governor on September 30th, 2020. A little background on the SB 203 deals with juvenile custodial interrogation, peace officers interrogating minors. Prior to Amendment SB 203, a police officer was authorized to take a minor into temporary custody when that officer felt or was led to believe that the minor committed a crime or violated an order of the juvenile court. The law had required the police officer to advise the minor of the Miranda rights, that anything the minor said could be used against the minor, that the minor had the right to remain silent, that the minor has the right to have counsel present during any interrogation, and that the minor has the right to have counsel appointed if the minor is unable to afford counsel. This law was for youth 15 years and younger. And they would consult with legal counsel in person, by telephone, or by video conference prior to the custodial interrogation and before waiving any of their rights. The new bill applies these same provisions, the Miranda rights, from the previous bill to youth 17 years of age or younger, and would indefinitely extend operation of these provisions. The bill would direct a court to consider any willful failure of a law enforcement officer to allow a youth 17 years of age or younger to speak with counsel before a custodial interrogation in determining the credibility of the law enforcement officer. Section 625.6 of the Welfare and Institutions Code is amended to read, prior to a custodial interrogation and before the waiver of any Miranda rights, a youth 17 years of age or younger shall consult with legal counsel in person, by telephone, or by video conference. The consultation may not be waived. The Department of Juvenile Justice Reform, LA County has built up the largest infrastructure for policing and prisons. We have the largest infrastructure for municipal and county police, the largest sheriff's department in the world, largest county jails in the world, largest courts in the world, largest juvenile halls and youth prisons in the world right here in our county, says Kim McGill, Youth Justice Coalition, Los Angeles, in an interview with Eddie Conway of Rattling the Bars in Baltimore, Maryland on September 9th, 2020. The need to close the youth prisons has been debated for several years here in California. According to the Sacramento Bee newspaper dated August 13th, 2020, the youth prisons are ineffective. The worst possible action we can take is to congregate youth with problem behaviors in an institutional setting, separate them from teachers and relatives, and take away hope. Youth prisons also carry the stain of racism, with Black, Indigenous, and Latinx youth incarcerated at 5, 3, and 1.7 times the rate of white youth, respectively. Youth prisons are brutal environments with widespread sexual assaults, violence, and neglect. Recent research has shown that the system, as we know it, continues to expose youth to violence and trauma. Staff use of physical force against youth is high, and young people experience or witness fights, riots, or beatings regularly. When they are released, they are ill prepared for life. It is no wonder that individuals exiting these places have abysmally high rates of rearrest. In 2019-2020 State of California budget, Governor Gavin Newsom stated that he wanted the juvenile system that we know of as today to end. The juvenile justice system will be transferred from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to the Department of Health and Human Services. The governor says this change will enable the state to better provide youth offenders with services needed to be successful when they are released. Closing the youth prisons does not mean that no youth should never be removed from the community. Young people should not get a free pass to committing crimes, but they should be held accountable in ways that make them less, not more likely to reoffend. The traditional youth prisons associated with bad outcomes leading to educational, health, and economic deficiencies are paid for by all of us. Kim McGill says we have until 2023, which is not much time, to develop a different kind of vision for our juvenile justice system. What we're really pushing for is that most young people would be in community care or their homes. We think that community-based organizations, job training, etc., are better able to work with young people. And for that small fraction of young people that have the most serious charges, where the courts might not allow for community or home care, then we want youth development centers run by youth development experts, coaches, artists, teachers, not by correction officers or probation guards. The Center of Juvenile and Criminal Justice produced a fact sheet. State spending soars to historic levels amid reorganization of California's youth correctional system. In this report, it is stated that if approved by the legislature, state spending on DJJ, the Department of Juvenile Justice, will reach a record-setting $336,000 per year in fiscal year 2021, with a total budget of nearly $300 million. This proposed increase coincides with the planned reorganization of DJJ, which will transfer the responsibility for the 4 state-run youth correctional facilities from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, the state's prison system, into the California Health and Human Services. The budget proposes a large increase in staff positions as part of DJJ transition into the HHSA. Under the proposal, DJJ would increase its workforce by 31% over the 2018-2019 staffing to employing more than 1,400 full-time staff. Using the projection of 862 youth, the staff would be at a 1.6 DJJ staff for each youth. Data from June 2017 found that youth living units are staffed at a ratio of 1 for every 5 youth during the day and 1 staff for every 20 at night, which exceeds the national standard for safe nighttime staffing, 1 staff for every 16 youth. Because of the low population of prisoners, the staff can provide direct care to youth. Some staff positions have gone unstaffed, so hopefully with the planned increases, they would just simply fill those vacant positions. Currently, counties in the state of California pay $24,000 for each youth that is committed to DJJ from their county. The balance of that $336,000 is paid for by state taxes, which is $312,000. The high cost of the DJJ is much more than the spending on other services and programs for young people. For example, tuition at Stanford, one of the state's most expensive universities, cost about $50,000 per year per student. At the rate that we're charging $336,000, the state could possibly pay for 6 youth to attend Stanford University. So we need to start dealing with how can we reduce these fees, these expenses, and get our children and our youth back on a better road for success. And as it stands with oversight of the budget, the state and county monitor the spending of the budgeted monies. The court school education system. California will provide a world-class education for all students from early childhood to adulthood. The Department of Education serves our state by innovating and collaborating with educators, schools, parents, and community partners. Together as a team, we prepare students to live, work, and thrive in a multicultural, multilingual, and highly connected world. That's according to the California Department of Education mission statement. And it's often said that California schools are failing their students, and nowhere is this more visible and more obvious than the state's juvenile justice system. This system takes in some of the most challenged youth from our communities and promises to provide them treatment care, guidance, rehabilitation, and a better path forward. It is compulsory for juveniles under the age of 19. But our juvenile justice system's court schools are quickly sending our youth to dismal outcomes. They should be pushing the youth toward a diploma, higher education, and career training. But many court schools are not providing even the basic level of education to the youth. There were some recommendations made from an organization, Educational Injustice, Barriers to Achievement and Higher Education for Youth in California Juvenile Court Schools research paper from the Youth Law Center to hopefully alleviate or reduce some of these problems. California's juvenile justice system must do better at getting our youth to class and keeping them there. They're not attending class. So the recommendation is to eliminate truancies by holding the detention facilities in juvenile court schools accountable for ensuring that detained youth attend school and arrive on time. And just like truancy, suspensions mean more time out of school. The students are more likely to drop out of school and end up in the adult prison system. The recommendation is to eliminate suspensions in juvenile court schools. While the aim is to get youth back on track, the juvenile justice system has been failing at assessing and responding to special needs, failing at providing a high-quality, comprehensive education, failing at getting exiting youth back to their community schools, and failing at giving them the tools they need to graduate. Providing English learners with a quality education has been an issue in the California public schools, and it's much larger in the court schools. There is a recommendation on the table to require collaboration between court schools and probation to improve language access assessment and services. Moving youth from the Department of Juvenile Justice to the Department of Health and Human Services to be housed in communities and not prisons is going to require collaborations with numerous organizations and communities to really make incarceration to release a success. The Youth Law Center states that we have a legal, moral, and practical responsibility to ensure that youth who have experienced some of the most challenging childhoods receive the supports and guidance necessary to achieve their dreams and reach their full potential. I saw two questions pop up. I was trying to read and talk at the same time, but I saw.
May I read it to you, Alice?
Yes, please. Thank you.
The question is regarding the SB 203 proposal. How does that get passed and go into effect?
SB 203 was passed. It is a Senate bill now. It is law. So what it did is it changed the age from 15 and under to 17 and under. They found that through studies and different fact sheets and studies that children 15 years of age and younger don't even understand when they're answering a question what the consequence for that question is, and they're fearful anyway. So they feel that a child that's 17 years, 2 years older, would have a better command of understanding what is being asked of them. My personal opinion is that they should not talk until the parents are there. And there was one other one that came up, Carolyn. Did you get that one?
It's not directed at you.
Okay, thank you. Without any other questions, I'll turn the panel over to Sheila LaFridge. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Alice. So today I'm going to cover law enforcement response to mental illness emergencies across a few jurisdictions. I'd like to preface with two new developments that just occurred this week. The first, on Tuesday, was here in Long Beach. The family of Eugene Martindale III filed his family filed a lawsuit against the Long Beach PD for he was a mental health, he had a mental health illness episode. And when he went to seek help, he ended up being beat, chokehold, arrested, and then given probation when he should have either been helped or evaluated by the mental evaluation team. And then just as of yesterday, a new 2019 video was released of George Floyd to show his mental state and behavior in 2019 when he was arrested, kind of in the same typical scenario where he just lost his life. So I kind of wanted to preface with that as we go into looking at how law enforcement responds to mental health emergencies. And let's start with a look at what Long Beach Police Department is doing in the right direction, and then I'll cover best practices. So one of the top issues facing law enforcement agencies today, as we know, is how to deal with Americans with mental health needs. And that was the conclusion of a national law enforcement summit convened last November in Los Angeles and coordinated by a group called the Equitas Project. Long Beach City Prosecutor Doug Halbert attended that summit, and according to Halbert, there's a deliberate strategy locally to work together to look for better ways to address the intersection between mental illness and public safety. The Equitas Project's course corrections for a change in basic policy said, relying on police, sheriffs, and the criminal justice system to respond to the chronic and acute mental health needs of the population is neither appropriate, nor healthy, nor sound fiscal policy. This reliance upon public safety and justice system intervention for unaddressed health needs is a wasteful misapplication of resources and yields extremely poor health and safety outcomes at tremendous cost to individuals, communities, and the economy at large. According to the report, the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated population. And in that group, more than half have mental health needs. And incarceration is one of the most expensive and least effective ways to handle mental illness issues, whether they are substance abuse related or otherwise. A list of recommendations from the Equity Summit report includes coordinating community effort and resources, starting with a multidisciplinary group to develop and implement policies such as cross-training, shared databases, integrating 911 dispatch response with mental health crises lines, and providing mental health education for every level of the system, from the beat cops all the way up to the judges. Other categories of recommendations included healthcare partnerships, officer mental health, early redirection called diversion, and post-arrest procedures. It also said to have police departments adopt policies that emphasize force de-escalation and force prevention options, and emphasize that officer health and well-being must also be a top priority in every agency and community. So on the right, you see the Equities Project, on the right, there is a press release that came from November 2019, where Long Beach Police Department announced the consolidation of the mental evaluation team and their quality of life team. The mental evaluation team responds citywide, and the quality of life teams are assigned to individual patrol divisions. Inside of the press release, it also says a large percentage of homeless persons suffer from substance abuse and mental illness, and increased access to trained mental health clinicians provides officers with options for de-escalating volatile situations and connecting people in crisis to vital services. Next slide, please. Effective June 2020, Long Beach Police Department updated its use of force policy to expressly prohibit all types of chokeholds, and immediately suspended the use of the carotid restraint, which restricts blood flow. The police department already prohibits the use of chokeholds, that would be Long Beach Police Department, which restricts airflow as a neck restraint to overcome resistance under any circumstances, and has never allowed neck restraint using knees, legs, or feet. The Long Beach Police Department training schedule includes bi-monthly mental health training for training officers, who then are supposed to use the techniques while training recruits in the field. The Mental Health Academy program provides classroom training to new recruits while in the academy. And the mental evaluation team has a dispatch desk where all officers can make a request for the field, or the mental evaluation team can be dispatched based on the incident description when a patrol call is assigned. And this is in the Long Beach Police Department again. There are 6 mental evaluation teams, which include 1 clinician and 1 sworn officer each. There are 2 teams on day, 2 teams on night, and 2 teams that provide an overlap and handle the weekend calls. The public can call the mental evaluation team directly using the Long Beach MET non-emergency dispatch number, or call the Department of Mental Health request for service. You can also view an excellent video called Meet Grace and Officer Booker, and Grace is a psychiatric nurse assigned to the team. If you go on the internet and Google Long Beach Police Department MET for mental evaluation team, and then select videos and open Meet Grace and Officer Booker, will give you a good idea of what they are supposed to be doing in the field. Next slide, please. So in Oakland and Sacramento, we're going to talk about best practices across some of the jurisdictions. In Oakland and Sacramento, they use Mental Health First, a project of the Anti-Police Terror Project. It is a cutting-edge new model for non-police response to mental health crises. Their purpose is to interrupt and eliminate the need for law enforcement in mental health crisis first response by providing mobile peer support, de-escalation assistance, and non-punitive and life-affirming interventions, therefore decriminalizing emotional and psychological crises and decreasing the stigma around mental health, substance abuse, and domestic violence, while also addressing their root causes. Next slide, please. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, LASO, which also you might know as LASD for Los Angeles Sheriff Department or Los Angeles County Sheriff. They also police Lakewood, which is adjacent to Long Beach. They have a vehicle called empath, which is an acronym for Emergency Mobile Psychiatric Assessment via Telehealth. In 2019, the Sheriff's Mental Evaluation Team had 33 regional co-response teams, representing 55% of the 60 minimally recommended and needed teams countywide. That is just half of the minimum recommendation. They responded to 55% of the 10,425 calls because of mentally ill or cognitively impaired persons in crises. They use a triage desk to screen and manage the daily calls for service and send mental evaluation teams to those calls with the highest likelihood of an involuntary hold being necessary. As a result, the mental evaluation team handled 64.6% of all 9/11 level mental health crisis calls in Sheriff's Patrol jurisdictions during 2019. And one thing we do need to know is that the mental evaluation team calls actually exponentially increased over 113% in fiscal year 2018-19 over the previous 2 years. So there is a big issue and problem out there with the law enforcement having to handle the mental illness calls. They are very, very high. Let's go to the next slide, please. In this slide, this shows a chart, and the first middle circle shows that in Lakewood, the sheriffs received 538 direct mental health calls, resulting in 459 mental health holds. Also, of the 10,000 calls, which you see at the bottom, and this is in 2019, 5,697 or 55% of those calls were code 5150 mental illness calls. Next slide, please. So quite a few other agencies, such as in Harris County and Austin, Texas, are using online telehealth apps, such as mHealth and UnCloud9, that provide in-the-field virtual psychiatrists that enable remote consults launched by first responders in the field. Next slide, please. And then lastly, LAPD, a large enforcement agency like the LA County Sheriff, has a mental health unit. They also have a system-wide mental assessment response team, a mental evaluation unit of senior lead officers, a triage desk, a health assessment management team, and a designated administrative training detail for mental health. So let's go to our next slide. And the big question is this: with all the programs, training, resources across agencies, why do we have officers using lethal force and have mentally ill people dying and being seriously injured, resulting in massive civil payouts to families? Are officers using training and resources available, and what tracking and oversight in place to ensure officers are doing their best to go to options before using force while still keeping themselves and the public safe? Is the county sheriff's 50% response rate a reasonable expectation for success, or should it be higher? And then what can Long Beach Police Department and the LA County Sheriffs do better? This is why, as stated from the Equitas report, community effort and resources are needed, starting with a multidisciplinary group to develop and implement policies in all law enforcement agencies. And that is where we come in, the public and the community. There are several groups and ways to become involved, such as in Long Beach, the Citizens Police Complaint Commission. There's the Police Budget Coalition, Black Lives Matter, the Equitas Project, and Campaign Zero, which is worth reading about, as well as League of Women Voters. Last slide. Here are some resources where you can get a lot of information on how our law enforcement agencies are handling the mental health crisis that is in the system. And if you'd like a list of either of these resources, please you can request it in the chat box. That concludes the mental health side of this, and I'm going to pass it back to Carolyn Eggleston.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That was wonderful.
You're welcome.
So what I'd like to do in this last part is, before we do questions and answers, is talk a little bit about some of the movement in California on criminal justice and police reform, because it's been an active measure for quite a while in California, and we're really making some strides. So I want to talk about some legislation that was recently signed by the governor, so are now in effect. The first one is AB 2542, and it's called the California Racial Justice Act. And this is one of the more broad-based programs because it does address a number of specific problems that have existed in the criminal justice system. And of course, the biggest thing is that it's eliminating, to the extent that we can, eliminating the use of race, ethnicity, or national origin in sentencing and convictions, because we have quite good evidence that demonstrates that has been a problem here as in everywhere else, but what we're addressing California. And it asserts civil rights of the people who are being accused and sentenced inappropriately. So we will have still some work to do on this, but it does give civil rights to people, largely people of color, that haven't been getting them, people living in poverty, et cetera. So this is really a broad-based act to try to address the racial portions of our system. Next slide, please. A couple more that have just been signed by the governor. One is AB 2512, which is intellectual disability and death row. In the United States, it was made unconstitutional for someone with intellectual disabilities to get the death penalty, to be executed, because of the question of whether or not they really fully understood their bad behavior. So what California has done in a response to that is prosecutors have been using race-based arguments to keep people on death row. So for example, they say that, well, because of these people who live in poverty, people of color are from bad schools, that their IQ is really higher than what has been tested. So that gives them the excuse to raise their IQ far enough so that then they can be executed. And it's been practiced in this state for a little while. So this eliminates that possibility. You can't arbitrarily have somebody adjust an IQ score because of their background. That's like saying they're really stupider than they are, than we believe they are. But this one is saying you cannot also make it as if their IQ score is higher. That standard is there for a reason. Next slide, please. Another one that has been recently signed is AB 1185, and that's the Sheriff's Accountability Act. And please forgive me, I just found a typo. It's just the way it's going to be. But what it really is supposed to say is give subpoena power to oversight bodies, and includes more teeth. This is the 30-year problem we have had with the community oversight groups, because we have them in quite a number of cities and counties around the country, but the way that they are written do not provide enough support for the oversight body to do anything about it. So typically what had been happening is these commissioners would give their report and send it to the police, and then nothing would happen because it was a recommendation. There was nothing to be done. So this Sheriff's Accountability Act is helping with our Los Angeles County especially to start developing the ability to use the information that is provided. And the last one, not last, the next one is AB 3070, which is anti-discrimination in jury selection. This has been a problem because so far, you know that in a court case, each side can, as they're reviewing 4 jurors, each side can say no to somebody. And they don't have to have any reason for it, it's just no. And we've seen these cases where, for example, if it's a Black defendant, the prosecution just eliminates as many Black people on the panel, on the jury as they can. And so this is a real move in the right direction to make sure that the jury of their peers represents them. And so promising more fairness in jury selection because of that implicit bias. We're not talking about anybody deliberately getting on a jury so they can, you know, mess somebody up. It's this unknown bias that we all possess. So this helps to move that. Next slide, please. This is a really important piece of legislation that was passed. It's AB 392, California Act to Save Lives. It became effective this January. It had been passed last year, and it updates what we're doing about use of force policy. Because as Jane said, and several other people have said, this is a problem we're facing in this country. And the balance has moved from protecting the accused to protecting the officers. So we're seeing these officers who are responding in ways that exceed use of force standards. And so what we've done, particularly with this legislation, is this word necessary, where it says authorizing deadly force only when necessary, because it hasn't been that strict. 15 of the police departments with the highest rates of per capita police killings reside in California. And unfortunately, they also unfairly impact communities of color. And so moving from whenever possible as a standard for use of force to only when necessary means that the police officers have to justify why they used force in that particular situation. So it ups the standard. And we're working right now across the state. Legal Women Voters is a very important partner. We're working on ensuring that each police jurisdiction has revised their use of force standards in their policies so that it includes this when necessary. And we're spending a lot of time working on it because the police departments have not been speedy in answering this call. Now, the ACLU did a study of all of the use of force policies, and Long Beach has been approved as acceptable. It's not, they're not super strong in their policy and procedures, but they are acceptable according to ACLU. Next slide. And this is sort of a companion piece to the AB 392. 1506 is proposed, it's before the ballot. And what this is to do is to provide more accountability for deadly force, because we have experienced problems where police have been able to justify the killing by whatever they say. This requires that the Attorney General has to investigate these particular killings. Now, the problem with this one is it says involve killings of unarmed individuals. And we've seen cases where somebody might have a big stick, and that can be considered being armed. And so the standard is pretty low about what armed means. It's not having a gun in front of you. It could be lots of different things, which is a problem for people with mental health issues, particularly, as Sheila had mentioned. Next slide. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about the criminal justice propositions and our local measures that might be relevant, because it's just more information to have. And this is information that comes from the League of Women Voters information. Prop 17 provides for people who are still on parole to be able to register and to vote. At this point, people have to have completed not only their prison term, but also their parole or probation before they can actually register to vote in elections. This would mean that they could still do that while on parole. And as you probably know, some folks can be on parole for 6 years. So that's a real way to get people who have done their time to get back in and being part of the culture, because voting is one of our fundamental rights. Prop 20 is in response to all of the areas of criminal justice that have been improved and detailed in the last 10 years in California, and this would undo some of that. It increases penalties to make property crimes that can be determined to be, I'm blanking on my head, sorry. Penalty for property crimes can actually be included in a felony charge, not just misdemeanor, and that the state can collect DNA from anybody who had a misdemeanor. And people are not in favor of having their DNA done that way. And then Prop 25 is the bail problem, which we have been dealing with for years and years, because when you look at people who are in jail awaiting trial, they're almost always people of color and people who are living in poverty. And so this gets rid of the cash bail, because if I get arrested and I have a bail set, I'm probably going to beg probably people in this audience for money so that I can get out on bail. That is something that some people can do and others don't have the financial wherewithal. So this really deals with more keeping somebody in jail if they've done something violent and need to be locked away because of their violence, and not just because they can't afford it. That's really one of the big issues. Next slide. In LA County, we have Measure J, which is the charter amendment that the Board of Supervisors have proposed, and it allocates part of the additional part of the budget for support for the poor. So programs, youth programs, recreation things, the county would be allowed to take some of the current budget and reallocate 10% to community support. And then Measure US, which is Long Beach, to raise the tax on oil production so that we can again have more community programs for youth, the poor, and others. And I think that's it. Now, we do have some questions, if you don't mind me directing them to folks. Let's see. We have one question for Sheila. Are 2 teams, this is for the MET teams, are 2 teams per day and night enough? Sheila?
So yes, I'm here. So in fact, you know, the calls go up, calls go down. They can't actually predict how many, but the 2 teams are not enough, because actually I could not get from Long Beach, I could not get what their recommendation, their minimum recommendation is, but it is a bit low. They probably could use more teams to go out. You know, sometimes it's not enough to cover the calls that are coming in at the time. So some of the, I want to say the Los Angeles County Sheriffs actually had the best online, when you go into their website, access to data. Long Beach Police Department did not have that access to data. So as far as looking at the combination of how many calls they have versus the ratio of how many teams they're running at a time. Actually having 2 teams on each watch is probably not enough. There's a lot of people, a lot of calls coming in, and there is a lot of mental health. As we see, 50% of the calls across the board are mental health calls or related in some way.
Thanks, Sheila. And you have another question before we let you off the hook. Do you feel, after your research, that the city is doing enough to provide better mental health assistance instead of treating those with mental health issues just like other criminals?
So I would agree with the question
Yes,
I would agree with the question that was previously posed. Is it enough that is being done out there? First of all, they probably could always use additional staffing, and that's a budget issue. But in addition to that, my question was, are officers using the training and the resources that are available out there? And I don't remember which, I don't know if it was in Carolyn's presentation that said the officers are doing one thing, but just because when they complete a report and it says it went down this way, that doesn't mean they use the options that were out there. You know, this is part of the problem with the reform that we are requesting right now. The reporting is not always true. It's not always forthcoming. And if there had not been the video that came out in George Floyd when he was unfortunately killed with a knee on his neck, that report went in as a medical emergency. It did not go in as a homicide at the hands of the use of force. So part of the problem is having the officers to be accountable. And one of the also latest changes that was reported yesterday or this week in court documents is that with the reforms, they're asking for not just when a person is arrested, they are a suspect and what have you, and they go back in court and the prosecutor pulls up all their past information and then uses that to build a case. The same thing with the officers, as in the case of, I think his last name is Chauvin, for George Floyd, the officer who had the knee on the neck. They want to go back and they want to look at what this person's past performances have been. How many use of forces have they had? They want to bring that in. And that also needs to come into the case of reform in the departments, because if you have officers who are, in fact, have had quite a few of these types of police complaints, that needs to be addressed.
thank you. The next question, I'm going to start, and I'd love for anybody else to jump in if they don't mind. How can reforming the Police Oversight Commission address some of these commission in Long Beach? Long Beach is, the Long Beach Citizen Commission is active. There is a lot of discussion about that one not having any teeth as well. There's really just recommendation option. So our Police Oversight Commission is pretty much operating like most are in the state. And I'll pass it along in just a minute, but I want to make one more point, and that is one of the things we're trying to look at in policing reform is the provision, developing a provision in California where if a police officer is fired, the way it stands now, they can go to another jurisdiction next door and get a job as a police officer. There is no information flow. There is no requirement that someone get hired who has or has not had any bad history. And so that's one of the things we're also trying to work on is, you know, we shouldn't allow people to get fired to go to district to district to district. And there are something like 45 police officers we know who were fired for cause in one county or city and are now working in another one in California. But I had forgotten to say that and I wanted to, but the Police Oversight Commission, does anybody else want to talk about that?
No, I don't have any additional info.
Anybody else? Let's see. This is another question. As far as the Sheriff Accountability Act needs more teeth, like what? What do cops go out? How do cops go out to get another job? It sounds like the church and the police. Actually, that's a pretty good way to say it. It needs to have more teeth, and this would be one of the things these accountability commissions would be able to do, is to help facilitate information sharing between these districts and pass a law that does not, provides the police officer from getting a job somewhere else, even after they have been fired from another place. We need to have that information. Any other questions? I was a founder of the CPCC. May I speak? I don't know how to do that.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, Barbara.
Okay, yeah, my name is Barbara Shoag, and I'm a past president of the league about 30 years ago. And I was actually in the chair with the head of the NAACP at the time, chairing the committee that put the charter amendment on the ballot in Long Beach to establish the CPCC, the Citizen Police Complaint Commission, and I served as its first chair. And can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And it was, I was on the rules committee when we were, it passed in all 9 districts. And then we had to establish our rules. And it was a very frustrating experience for me because the administrator at the time had been a library administrator, and he was a very meek man. Well, you know, the police, they have to have discretion, you know, discretion. And there was a retired sheriff also on the rules committee. And so, you know, we wanted subpoena power, we wanted to have hearings, and it didn't turn out that way. So I think that probably a lot of reform is needed. And we just had investigators, people could make complaints, and then there were investigators that would go out and interview people, and we would get reports. And so often we would say we knew it happened, but we couldn't prove it. I mean, almost unless an officer admitted to have done wrong, you know, it was hard to sustain a complaint. So for what it's worth, the league was very involved in that at the time, and it needs some reform. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a really important little piece to add. The next question, and it's not directed to anyone, so we can all decide who wants to speak. We have a sex offender registry. Could we have a similar registry for violent officers?
So Carolyn, I'll take a brief on that unless someone else wants to speak. One of the recommendations, or in the list of recommendations that came out of the Equitas project, was to have shared databases. And those shared databases is not just the databases that exist, but also to create a database of officers who were fired and what they were fired for, especially if, well, obviously, if they were fired and dismissed out of jurisdiction, any jurisdiction, then they should not be allowed to go anywhere else and to get employment in law enforcement. And so that is one of the recommendations. But again, understand how powerful the unions are in not wanting to allow certain things to occur. As far as putting the officers under a microscope and also holding certain levels of accountability. And it's just actually is kind of amazing, as we saw with all of the protests going on and the disruption following George Floyd, that a lot of the police jurisdictions took the position that we don't want the defunding. Not understanding defunding is that we're not we're not trying to get rid of all of the police law enforcement agencies. We need policing. We need to be safe. We need those agencies to make sure that the citizens are safe. However, we also need to make sure that the officers are not the predators out there, and that they're doing their job in a manner that is supportive and enhances the safety of the community and does not threaten it. And so that just kind of shows you the power and the mindset when we had officer agencies that in whole said, well, we're all not going to come to work, or we're all not going to do this, or, and just took a complete stance of defiance against trying to make things better.
Thanks, Sheila. Anybody else want to anything or add anything to that? Okay, she said it well. Here's another question. How does this happen? This oversight committee sounds useless now as it stands. It was set up per Barbara as an appeasement for the system. Will AB 1185 give it the right bite? I'll answer that one, and I would say it's a first step. We're not going to get there right away, and we're going to have to do it, I believe, in incremental steps. And so it's a step in the right direction. It won't solve our problems. Plus, the police unions have been very much against having any kind of this accountability made stronger. So we're really hoping this will be a move in the right direction. I guess that's the best way I can say it. Are there any other questions? Because I don't have any on my little list here. Oh, I do want to say one person said, hence the need for body cams, which I think is quite right when we're talking about some of this stuff. How about closing arguments or points that you would like to reiterate, team?
I asked Kimberly a question privately. I was wondering if maybe she could answer it publicly.
All right, we're monitoring the Q&A. Can you go ahead and ask it again?
Jan, you're muted.
Got it. Hold on. I had turned it off. Let's see.
Oh, I didn't see this one.
To Kim, she had mentioned that there was an era of professionalizing policing in the 50s and 60s. My experience was that some of the worst of police brutality happened in the 50s and 60s. The riots, the total brutalization of Black communities, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I had some personal experiences with New York City police. There was nothing that resembled professionalism during that period or in the early 70s. So I'm wondering, what was the effort, and was it measured in terms of success? And was it that maybe the effect of that wasn't seen until later?
Yeah, I think that was what happened, that the reforms and the efforts for citizen oversight and more transparency and additional training came about from people witnessing the brutality of the response to the civil unrest on their TVs. And it's not that they started professionalizing in the 50s and 60s. I think the process started, and it was ongoing throughout that whole era, through the 70s, and it continues today. So whereas in the early days of policing, I mentioned that the police were seen as a corrupt part of a corrupt city government, common throughout the United States, that it was finally recognized. And I think having this stuff televised helped lead to a push from the people seeing that for the police departments to professionalize and start to get more scrutiny from the public.
Also, I don't know if everybody knows, but the policing in the South, in the southern part of the US, the police officers who went, when they first started developing them, they were designed to be slave catchers. And that's their history. Their job was to catch slaves and come back. And then they also then became law enforcement, official law enforcement. So that's a tiny bit scary. But yes, Kim.
One other thing I want to say, part of too what is going on with this movement to reform police unions is addressing police Bill of Rights laws. And these laws came about after a series of Supreme Court decisions in 1974. They were intended to protect law enforcement personnel from investigation and prosecution as they were performing their duties. And what it gave them were additional privileges based on due process than normal citizens get. And throughout the years, these Bill of Rights, police Bill of Rights laws have been used to make it harder for the public to get access and visibility into police bad behavior. And in fact, turns out that one of the most stringent Bill of Rights laws is right here in California, and it was first passed in 1976 by Governor Jerry Brown. And so getting more insight into, you know, and investigation into when it seems like the police officer has done something wrong, oftentimes it's blocked by these laws. So part of reforming police unions also has to do with maybe weakening or, you know, trying to reform these Bill of Rights laws as well.
Thank you. Anybody else? Jane?
I just wanted to say that about the body cams. I mean, that was one of the things that was a reform in a way recently. But there was still that act of violence or that act of something that brought the protests out. Even though that showed it, and we were lucky for it, it was it was a reform, and it does take a while for all of that to come through. And so regardless of how effective or ineffective that is, it produced some other results, which maybe now we'll get more reform.
Really good.
That's it.
Could I speak again? Could I speak again, please?
Sure.
Yeah, I'd like to mention that I don't remember if it was the CPCC or the Police Advisory Commission before that, but one of the first cases that came to us had to do with the jail elevator, and people would get into the jail elevator in perfect shape and get out several stories up, all beaten up. So one of our first recommendations was that there be a camera in the jail elevator, and all of a sudden people were ending up at the jail level in better shape, though occasionally the camera didn't work. So I frankly think that cameras are one of the most important citizen protections we have. And interestingly enough, when we had the campaign for the CPCC, our Long Beach Police Officers Association actually supported it. And that's because they thought the citizens would give them an easier time of it than the police, the police brass, which I found interesting then, and I guess it hasn't happened now. And I couldn't agree more that anybody who's been fired from one department should never serve as a police officer again anywhere. So those are some thoughts. Thank you for letting me speak. I thought this was a wonderful presentation. I just commend each and every one of you.
Thank you, Barbara. Appreciate your comments and your knowledge. Another question, what is the city doing to correct the imbalances in the diversity in the police versus the people they represent?
Okay, so looking at demographic makeup that I showed on my first slide, I did not find in my research any specific actions that the police department is taking. Wide throughout the city government, effort to address imbalances in the race and ethnicity makeup of throughout the city. So hence we have now a Department of Equity that is looking at these issues. And then that is also part of the Equity and Racial Reconciliation Initiative that the city is undertaking. So while I don't know specifically what the police department is doing, it is a city government-wide effort to correct those imbalances, because we all know that a representative democracy, for it to work best, actually has to represent the constituency it serves.
Excellent. And the reconciliation program that was developed was very clear in trying to improve some of this. They didn't have, in my mind, they didn't have super detailed ideas about how they were going to move that along, but they have addressed the problem and are looking to improve it in the reconciliation. One more question, kind of a question you guys can respond. Unless this is talking about officer firings and being able to go to another county, unless the officer was unfairly fired or bullied out of the police brotherhood for other reasons than overuse of violence. So what you're suggesting, I guess, is we can't assume that everybody getting fired was fired for violent cause. And I think that's a really good point. Anybody else want to add to that?
I would add my concern to that person. I worked in HR for a long time. There are reasons why people are fired that should never be revealed to the general public. And one that comes to mind is that women get fired for reporting sexual harassment. And they should never be banned because of that. So I think that whole idea of there have to be some limits to firing people, and then they're never hired again. And we all know the reason, and they're never hired again by any other police department.
Very good. Anybody?
Carolyn.
Yes.
Carolyn, this is Sheila. I just wanted to kind of bring it to everyone's attention that we're in 2020, and the Los Angeles County Sheriffs are just now starting a rollout of body cam. They're behind the mark. They're behind a lot of other agencies, and they fought it. And so it does take the public and the power of the public to fight the power of the unions. And there is a Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Committee that was incremental in making the sheriffs get that in the budget, put those body cams on the officers, and start rolling that out. And it's just now started rolling out this third quarter of 2020. And as we saw with LAPD and some other jurisdictions, they had to bring additional policy to make sure that those body cams are not turned off. Just like someone mentioned, the elevator camera sometimes got turned off. And so it does take the power of voice and community to move these positions and policies along. And as you said, incrementally, it takes small steps to make big changes. And so everybody needs to, get involved and put the power of their voice and their pen where they can to make sure that these reforms and changes take place and that they don't get washed down and pushed backward as well.
Beautiful summary. Thank you. I don't see any more questions. I did want to give regrets from Alice Pitts, who was one of our speakers. She had to get on to another engagement, but she sends her regrets for not being through this whole thing. Kim.
I just wanted to mention to everyone that Lisa will be posting the recording of this session. It'll be on our website tonight at lwvlongbeach.org, and she will also put in the comments section all of the links that Sheila showed us for resources.
Yeah, and I'll have a list of the attendees. This is Jane. I will send all of you that list of resources also.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order?
I think a very large thank you to all of you who worked on this event. Very informative, very well done, and so proud to be a part of an organization that is so professional in presenting this event. So thank you very, very much.
And thank you all team members, because this was yeoman's work. Oh, wait a minute, there may be one more question. Please share the link with the others. We know, yeah, you already said you do that. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been very interesting, and we hope we provide a little bit of information and help you think on these issues. Thanks very much.